An orphan boy sends a note to a stranger. After what happens next leaves everyone in tears. The city was alive with movement, crowds rushing past, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional honk of an impatient driver. But for Elliot, the world felt quiet, muted, like he was standing still while life passed him by. His hands trembled as he clutched a small, crumpled piece of paper. The note was worn, slightly torn at the edges. He had folded and unfolded it so many times, the ink was starting to smudge. But the words were still there, still clear, still his only hope. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. People didn't notice him. Or maybe they did, and they just chose to look away. He had gotten used to it, to being invisible, to being just another orphan kid with no home, no name, no future. But today was different. Today, he wasn't asking for food. He wasn't begging for spare change. Today, he was taking a chance that this note, this tiny, fragile thing, could change everything. His eyes darted through the crowd, searching, looking for the right person. And then, he saw him. A man in a dark coat, walking with purpose. His face was serious, unreadable. Something about him felt fake. Elliot's heart pounded. This was it. Now or never. He moved quickly, stepping in front of the man before his courage failed him. The man nearly bumped into him, stopping abruptly. "Hey, watch where you're..." He trailed off as he looked down. His eyes met Elliot's. And for the first time in a long time, Elliot saw someone really look at him. Not through him, not past him, but at him. Elliot swallowed hard. And then, without a word, he held out the note. His hands shook as he lifted it. The man hesitated. Then slowly he took it. His fingers brushed against the paper, feeling the wear, the desperation woven into its creases. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words. And in an instant his face changed. From confusion, to shock, to something Elliot couldn't quite place. Something that looked an awful lot like pain. His throat worked as he read the note again, his hands tightening around it. Finally, his lips parted, and he whispered, almost to himself, "Where did you get this?" Elliot didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stood there, staring, waiting for the man to understand. Waiting for him to put the pieces together. The man's breathing was uneven now. His hands shook slightly as he folded the note back up, but not before Elliot saw his eyes dart to the name written at the bottom. A name that wasn't Elliot's. A name that meant nothing to anyone else in this city, but everything to him. The man exhaled sharply, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother." Elliot's stomach twisted. He had spent his whole life imagining what it would feel like to hear those words. To hear someone acknowledge that she existed. That she wasn't just a ghost of a memory in his mind. That she was real. And now? It felt like he couldn't breathe. The man's face was unreadable, but his eyes held something Elliot had never seen before. Regret. Recognition. Elliot's fingers curled at his sides. He forced himself to find his voice. "You know her?" he asked, his voice small. The man swallowed hard. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he nodded. Yes. A silence stretched between them. Thick, heavy. It felt like the whole world had gone quiet. Elliot's heartbeat was so loud in his own ears, he was afraid the man could hear it too. And then, after what felt like a lifetime, the man whispered the words that changed everything. "She was the love of my life." Elliot felt his knees almost give out. His head spun. The weight of those words, of that truth, was too much. It crashed over him like a tidal wave, swallowing him whole. He had spent his whole life alone, wondering, hoping, praying that somewhere, someone knew his mother, that someone remembered her, that she wasn't just a nameless woman who disappeared without a trace. And now, here was a man who loved her, a man who recognized her name, a man who looked at him like he was seeing a ghost from his past. Elliot's lips parted slightly, his voice trembling. "Then why didn't you come for me?" The man closed his eyes. His face twisted with something raw, unspoken. Elliot's stomach clenched. He knew that look. That was the look of someone who carried regret like a second skin. like a wound that never healed. The man inhaled shakily. "I never knew." The words hit Elliot harder than he expected. "I never knew she had a son." Elliot's breath caught. His mind reeled. That didn't make sense. His mother had left this note for him. She had written this man's name. Why would she do that if he never knew? His voice was barely a whisper. "She wrote your name." The man nodded slowly. "She did." He exhaled shakily, looking down at the note like it held a lifetime of answers he had never gotten. And then, his voice broke. "I should have been there." A lump formed in Elliot's throat. He had spent years dreaming of this moment. Dreaming of the day he would find someone who was supposed to love him. And now that it was here? It wasn't simple. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the happy ending he had imagined. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The man looked at him then. Really looked at him. Like he was seeing more than just a boy. Like he was seeing everything he had lost. Like he was seeing the second chance he never thought he'd get. Slowly, carefully, he knelt in front of Elliot, his hands shaking as he reached out. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he whispered. Elliot's breath hitched. His whole life had been spent watching people walk away. But now, for the first time, someone was reaching for him. Someone was choosing him. Elliot stared at the man's outstretched hand. And for the first time in his life, he took it. Elliot's fingers curled around the man's hand. It felt strange. Steady. Like something he was supposed to remember but had never felt before. The man's grip tightened slightly, not in a forceful way, but as if he was making a silent promise. A promise that Elliot wasn't invisible anymore. The sounds of the street faded into the background. The people rushing past, the honking cars, the distant chatter, none of it mattered. Because for the first time, Elliot wasn't just watching the world move around him. Someone had stopped for him. Someone had seen him. And now, he needed answers. The man let out a slow breath, looking down at the crumpled note again. His name, Daniel Grant, was written in faded ink, next to the words Elliot had memorized since the day he could read. "Find him. He will help you." Daniel swallowed hard. "She wrote this?" Elliot nodded. "She left it with me when I was a baby." Daniel's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "She knew." His voice was hoarse. "She knew she wasn't coming back." Elliot's stomach twisted. He had spent years imagining different stories. Maybe his mother had been sick. Maybe she had been in trouble. Maybe she had just been too young, too scared. But he never wanted to believe that she had known all along that she would never see him again. "What happened to her?" Elliot whispered. Daniel exhaled sharply. He looked like a man who had been waiting his whole life for this conversation, and yet had never been ready for it. "She was my best friend," he said finally. His voice was thick, like the words were too heavy to speak. "We grew up together. She was the kindest, strongest person I ever knew." Elliot swallowed hard. "She never told you about me?" Daniel's face twisted in pain. "She never got the chance." The truth about his mother. Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the note. He didn't look at Elliot as he spoke. He couldn't. If he did, he would see too much of her. "We lost touch for a while after high school," he admitted. "I went to college in another city. She stayed behind." His voice grew softer. "One day, I got a letter from her. She said she had something important to tell me." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I was busy with work. Told myself I'd visit when I had time." The pause. A deep, regretful silence. "But I waited too long." Elliot's chest tightened. Daniel finally turned to him. "By the time I came back," his voice broke slightly. "She was gone." Elliot froze. A sharp ache filled his throat, like he had swallowed broken glass. "She died?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I never got to see her. Never got to say goodbye." His hands clenched into fists. "I didn't even know she had a son." Elliot could barely breathe. So this was it. The answer he had been searching for his whole life. His mother was never going to come back. She had never abandoned him. She had just never had the chance. And this man, this stranger, was supposed to be the one to help him. But he never came. Because he never knew. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, oblivious to the storm inside Elliot's chest. Daniel whispered something. Something so soft, so quiet, that Elliot almost didn't hear it. "I failed her." Elliot's breath hitched. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders tense with guilt. "I should have been there," he said. "I should have come sooner. I should have—" He cut himself off, exhaling shakily. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elliot understood, because he had spent his entire life wondering the same thing. Why wasn't I enough for her to stay? Why didn't she come back? Why did she leave me alone? Now he knew the truth. She hadn't. She had tried. But time had taken the choice away from her. And now, Elliot was standing in front of the one person she had trusted to protect him. The question was, would he? Elliot finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't there for her." Daniel flinched. The words cut deep. Elliot's fingers curled into fists. "But you can be here now." Daniel's eyes snapped to him. Elliot didn't look away, didn't back down. He had spent his whole life waiting for someone to choose him, waiting for someone to say, "Come home." But now, he wasn't asking. He was telling. His mother had left one last request. Find him. He will help you. And Daniel had a choice. To keep running, or to finally step up. Daniel let out a slow, shaky breath. His whole body felt heavy, like the weight of all his regrets had finally come crashing down on him. He had lost her, but he wasn't going to lose this. Not again. Slowly, carefully, he reached out. His hand hovered over Elliot's shoulder for a second, as if he was afraid of breaking him. Then, finally, he rested it there. Steady. A promise. "I'm here now," he whispered. Elliot's breath hitched. His vision blurred. And for the first time in his entire life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The first step toward home. They didn't go back to Daniel's apartment that night. Not yet. Instead, Daniel took Elliot to a small diner on the corner of the street. Somewhere warm. Somewhere he could think. Elliot sat across from him, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of him. Daniel watched him carefully. He could see the way Elliot's fingers hovered slightly over the fork, like he was waiting for someone to take it away. "Eat," Daniel said gently. Elliot hesitated. Then, slowly, he picked up the fork, took a small bite. Daniel exhaled softly. This boy, his best friend's son, had been surviving on his own for so long. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But now he had a chance to fix it, to do what he should have done all those years ago. As Elliot ate in silence, Daniel pulled out the note again, ran his fingers over the faded ink. "Find him. He will help you." She had trusted him, even after all those years, even when he hadn't deserved it. His throat tightened. He wasn't going to let her down again. He looked at Elliot, his son. No, not just hers. His too. "I don't know what kind of father I'll be," Daniel admitted softly. Elliot froze. His grip on the fork tightened. "But if you let me," Daniel's voice was almost pleading now. "If you let me, I'd like to try." Elliot's breath shook. And for the first time in his life, he nodded. The diner was quiet except for the faint clinking of utensils and the low hum of a radio playing in the background. Elliot ate slowly, cautiously, as if he was afraid the food would disappear if he wasn't careful. Daniel watched him, his chest tight. The boy had probably never had a proper meal without wondering if it would be his last. It wasn't right. None of it was right. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, felt the crushing weight of responsibility settle over him. He had failed Elliot's mother. But he wasn't going to fail him. Not now. Not ever. The first night together. After they left the diner, Daniel hesitated before hailing a cab. "Where have you been staying?" he asked carefully. Elliot shuffled his feet. "A shelter. Sometimes outside." Daniel clenched his jaw. Shelters weren't always safe. And outside? That wasn't an option. "You're staying with me tonight?" he said, voice firm. Elliot stiffened. He didn't say anything, but Daniel could see it, the hesitation, the fear of hope, the fear that if he believed this, it would be taken away. Daniel exhaled. "You don't have to trust me yet," he admitted. "But I'm not leaving you out here alone." Elliot's shoulders tensed. Then finally he nodded. It was small, hesitant, but it was something. The cab ride was silent. Elliot kept his arms hugged around himself, staring out the window. Daniel stole a glance at him. What was he supposed to say? That he was sorry? That he wished things had been different? That he was going to fix everything? Words didn't mean anything. Not yet. Elliot had spent his whole life being let down. If Daniel wanted to change that, he had to show him. The apartment. When they arrived at Daniel's apartment, Elliot hesitated at the doorway. Daniel noticed. It wasn't hesitation because of fear. It was hesitation because Elliot didn't know if he was allowed to walk inside. Like he was waiting for permission. Daniel's chest ached. "You don't have to stand there," he said gently. Elliot glanced at him, unsure. Then, cautiously, he stepped inside. His movements were careful, like he thought one wrong step would get him kicked out. Daniel ran a hand over his face. No kid should feel like a stranger in a home. Especially not this kid. He led Elliot into the small but comfortable living room. "You can sleep in my guest room," Daniel said, walking toward the hallway. "It's not much, but—" His voice caught in his throat when he turned around. Elliot wasn't following him. He was standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the photos. Daniel's breath hitched, because he knew what Elliot was seeing. Photos of her, of his mother, of the woman Daniel had loved and lost. His heart pounded as Elliot reached out a hand, his fingertips hovering over a framed picture on the shelf. It was old, slightly faded, but she was smiling, the way she always used to smile at him. "You kept these," Elliot whispered. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "Of course I did." Elliot's fingers trembled. And for the first time since they met, Daniel saw tears in his eyes. Not just sadness, but proof. Proof that she had existed. Proof that she had been loved. Proof that she hadn't just been a distant memory that only he carried. Daniel stepped closer. He wasn't good at this. He had never been a father before. But he knew what it meant to hold someone up when they were about to fall. So he did. He placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder, steady, warm. Elliot didn't pull away, didn't flinch. And for the first time, he let himself cry, learning to trust. The next few days were an adjustment. For both of them, Daniel had spent years alone, keeping people at a distance. Now there was a boy in his house who didn't know what it was like to have someone care for him. And Elliot? He was learning what it meant to trust someone again. The first night, Elliot didn't sleep in the bed. Daniel found him curled up in the corner of the room, like he was too scared to take up space. Daniel didn't force him. He just handed him an extra blanket and said, "You don't have to be afraid here." Elliot didn't respond. But the next night, he slept in the bed. The first morning, Elliot didn't ask for food. Daniel noticed he was watching him cook, eyes darting toward the plates of eggs and toast, but he never reached for any. Like he was waiting for permission. So Daniel just set a plate in front of him and started eating his own. Elliot stared at it for a long time. Then, carefully, he picked up the fork and ate. The first week, Elliot never spoke unless spoken to. Daniel hated how normal it felt. Like this kid had spent his whole life being unnoticed. So Daniel made sure to talk to him anyway. Little things. "How was your day? You want to help me with this? You ever watch baseball?" At first, Elliot only answered in nods and shrugs. But then, one day, he asked Daniel a question. A simple one. "Did you really love my mom?" Daniel froze. His chest tightened. Then, slowly he nodded. More than anything. Elliot was quiet. Then, barely above a whisper, "I wish I remembered her." Daniel felt something break inside him. He reached for his phone, scrolled through some photos, and handed it to Elliot. "Then let me tell you about her." Elliot stared at the screen. A photo of her laughing, holding a book in her hands. And for the first time, Daniel saw it. A real, genuine smile. The first one Elliot had ever given him. The moment everything changed. One afternoon, Daniel was working in his home office when he heard a soft knock. Elliot stood at the doorway, fidgeting with his sleeve. Daniel put down his pen. "You okay?" Elliot hesitated. "Can I stay here?" Daniel's throat tightened. It wasn't a question about the night. or the next day, or the next week. It was a question about forever. Daniel stood up, walked over, knelt in front of him. "You don't ever have to ask that," he said. Elliot swallowed hard. And then, without hesitation this time, he hugged him. Daniel's breath hitched. Slowly he hugged him back. And in that moment, Daniel knew. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building a future. Together. The house was quieter than usual that evening. Elliot sat curled up on the couch, flipping through an old photo album Daniel had given him. Daniel, meanwhile, was in the kitchen, staring down at a set of legal documents. Foster care paperwork, custody forms, a path to adoption. It had been weeks since Elliot had asked to stay. Weeks since Daniel had made up his mind. But this made it real. This wasn't just a temporary shelter. This was forever. And Daniel had never done forever before. He had spent his whole life keeping people at arm's length. But Elliot? Elliot was different. Elliot was his second chance. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Then, without hesitation, he signed the first document. Elliot's fear. Later that night, Elliot lingered in the hallway, watching as Daniel stacked the papers neatly into a folder. The kid had grown comfortable in his presence, but there were still moments of hesitation. Moments when Daniel could see him bracing for disappointment. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked. Elliot shrugged. Then, softly, "Are you sure?" Daniel frowned. "Sure about what?" Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "About keeping me." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Hey." He put the papers down, walking over. "Look at me." Elliot hesitated before lifting his gaze. "I'm not keeping you, Elliot," Daniel said firmly. "This isn't charity. This isn't a favor. This is a choice. Your family." Elliot's eyes widened slightly, like he had never heard those words before. Daniel sighed, kneeling so they were eye level. "I should have been there for your mom," he admitted. "I can't change that, the beat. But I can be here for you. If you'll let me." Elliot's lip trembled. Then, slowly, so slowly it nearly broke Daniel's heart, he nodded. The day it became official. A week later, Daniel walked Elliot into the courthouse. Elliot stayed close, his fingers twitching at his sides. The courtroom was small, but intimidating. A place where decisions were made. Decisions that determined futures. Daniel didn't let go of Elliot's hand. Not once. The judge flipped through the paperwork, adjusting her glasses. "Mr. Grant," she said, glancing up. "This is an unusual case. You aren't related to Elliot by blood. What makes you want to take custody?" Daniel looked over at Elliot. The kid had been through hell. But forgotten. Alone. And despite it all, he had survived. Daniel turned back to the judge. "Because he deserves better than this system," he said. "He deserves a home. A family." The pause. "He deserves a future." Elliot's breath hitched. The judge studied them both for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. "Then let's give him one." Elliot's first real home. Walking out of the courthouse, Elliot gripped the paperwork tightly in his hands. His new birth certificate. His new last name. Elliot Grant. He traced his fingers over the words, barely believing it was real. Daniel nudged him lightly. "You good?" Elliot looked up at him. "Good," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, he actually meant it. The first holiday together. A few months later, the holidays arrived. Elliot had never celebrated Christmas properly. The orphanage had decorations, sure, but no tree, no stockings, no real family moments. So when Daniel brought home a massive Christmas tree, Elliot just stared. You got that for us?" he asked, voice quiet. Daniel smirked. "Well, I figured we should make some new traditions." Elliot swallowed hard. Then, without warning, he rushed forward and hugged Daniel tightly. Daniel froze. Elliot had been slow to trust, slow to open up. But now he was hugging him first. Daniel let out a shaky breath and hugged him back. "Yeah, kid," he murmured. "This one's for us. One final gift." That night, after dinner, Daniel handed Elliot a small wrapped box. Elliot blinked. "You already gave me presents?" Daniel smiled. This one's special. Elliot carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a framed photograph. It was a picture of his mother. And next to her? Daniel, you had this? Elliot whispered, his fingers shaking. Daniel nodded. She kept it. It was the last picture we took together. Elliot's throat tightened. It was the first time he had ever seen them together. Proof that his mother had loved someone. Proof that she had left him with the right person. A single tear slipped down Elliot's cheek. Daniel reached over, wiping it away with his thumb. You're home now, Elliot, he said softly. And Elliot, for the first time ever, believed him. The house was warm, filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights. The tree flickered in the corner, casting gentle shadows along the walls. Elliot sat on the couch, the framed photograph still in his hands, tracing his fingers over the glass. His mother's face stared back at him, frozen in time. Beside her, Daniel looked younger, happier. Before life had pulled them apart. Daniel watched him from the kitchen, sipping his coffee. He didn't say anything, didn't rush the moment. Elliot had been through enough. He knew better than to push. Elliot finally looked up. She really kept this? Daniel nodded. She carried it everywhere. Even when we lost touch, she never got rid of it. Elliot's lips pressed together, his mind turning over the words. She had held on to this piece of Daniel, even when she'd had nothing else. Maybe she had never truly been alone, even in her final moments. The thought made his chest ache. He set the frame down carefully beside him, rubbing his hands together. It's weird, he murmured. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What is? Elliot hesitated. Having the place to come back to. I keep thinking someone's going to take it away. Daniel exhaled slowly, setting his cup down on the counter. He walked over, taking a seat beside Elliot. No one's taking you away, kid. His voice was steady, firm. This is home. You're home. Elliot's hands clenched into fists on his lap. I don't even know how to be a family. I don't. He stopped himself, swallowing hard. What if I mess it up? Daniel let out a short laugh. Then you'll fit right in. Elliot blinked, looking up at him in confusion. Daniel smirked. I have no idea what I'm doing either. We'll figure it out. Silence stretched between them, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space. Elliot exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. Daniel nudged him. Now, come on. You haven't helped with the tree yet? Elliot looked at the pile of ornaments scattered across the floor. His fingers twitched, that old nervous habit of hesitation creeping back. I've never done it before. Daniel shrugged. Neither have I. Elliot gave him a skeptical look. You've never decorated a Christmas tree? Daniel scratched the back of his neck. I might have helped once. A long time ago. Elliot stared at him. Then, for the first time since they'd met, a small laugh escaped his lips. It was soft, barely there, but Daniel heard it. His chest warmed at the sound. Elliot reached for an ornament, carefully lifting it to the tree. He paused, glancing at Daniel. Like this? Daniel nodded. Yeah, just like that. They decorated in silence, the only sounds the occasional clink of glass ornaments and the distant hum of the radio playing holiday tunes. It was strange, comfortable. Halfway through, Elliot stepped back, tilting his head. Something's missing. Daniel smirked. The star? Elliot nodded. Daniel reached into the box, pulling out the topper. He handed it to Elliot. You do the honors. Elliot's eyes widened slightly. Me? Daniel lifted him without hesitation, hoisting him up so he could reach. Elliot let out a startled noise, but then he was laughing. Asterisk asterisk really laughing. Asterisk asterisk, and Daniel grinned as the boy placed the star on top. When he set him back down, Elliot stared up at the tree, his face unreadable. Then, so quietly Daniel almost didn't catch it. It's perfect. Daniel looked at him, the warmth in his chest spreading. Yeah, he murmured. It is. The next morning, Elliot woke up to the smell of coffee and something warm in the air. He sat up, blinking sleep from his eyes, before slowly padding out into the kitchen. Daniel was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes. Elliot hesitated in the doorway, watching. It was such a normal scene, so unfamiliar to him that it almost didn't feel real. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. You like pancakes? Elliot shrugged. I don't know. Daniel smirked. Guess we'll find out? Elliot sat at the table, watching as Daniel placed a plate in front of him. He picked up his fork hesitantly, cutting a small piece before tasting it. Daniel waited. Well, Elliot swallowed, then nodded. Daniel grinned. Good, because I kind of burnt the first batch. Elliot looked up, confused. There was a first batch? Daniel pointed toward the trash, where a plate of charred pancakes sat. Elliot snorted. That's embarrassing. Daniel feigned offense. Hey, watch it, kid. I'm the one feeding you. Elliot took another bite, trying to fight back a smile. But Daniel saw it anyway. Later that day, Daniel found Elliot sitting by the window, staring outside. Snow was falling lightly, blanketing the street below. Daniel walked over, standing beside him. You ever play in the snow? Elliot shook his head. Not really. Daniel smirked. Want to? Elliot hesitated. Isn't that for kids? Daniel shrugged. Who cares? Elliot studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. Okay. 10 minutes later, they were outside. Elliot was stiff at first, like he didn't quite know what to do. Daniel bent down, grabbing a handful of snow and packing it together. He tossed it lightly, hitting Elliot's arm. Elliot froze. Daniel grinned. What, first time getting hit with snow? Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he threw a handful of snow directly at Daniel's face. Daniel coughed, shaking the snow from his hair. Oh, you're in trouble now. Elliot took off running. Daniel chased after him, laughter echoing through the air. For the first time in his life, Elliot felt it. But pure, unfiltered joy. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt it too. That evening, Elliot sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket. His cheeks were still flushed from the cold, his hair slightly damp. Daniel sat beside him, flipping through an old book. Elliot shifted, rubbing his fingers together. Can I ask you something? Daniel glanced at him. Yeah. Elliot hesitated. Do you think she'd be proud of me? Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't ask who. He already knew. She'd be more than proud, he said softly. Elliot swallowed hard. Then, after a moment, he leaned against Daniel's side. Daniel froze for a second before carefully wrapping an arm around him. Elliot didn't move away. And for the first time, Daniel felt like he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A family. A home. Elliot closed his eyes, listening to the sound of the fire crackling. Daniel held him a little closer. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. For the first time, words weren't necessary. They had everything they needed. Right here. Together. The morning was cold, the air crisp with the lingering bite of winter. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the city itself had paused, holding its breath. Daniel drove with steady hands, though his mind raced with thoughts he hadn't fully processed. Elliot sat beside him, silent, his fingers gripping the small bouquet of white lilies in his lap. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They both knew where they were going. And why? Daniel had avoided this place for years. But today, he wasn't alone. Today, Elliot was with him. And that made all the difference. The cemetery stretched wide, lined with rows of markers, each carrying a name, a history, a life. Elliot followed Daniel through the winding path, his grip on the flowers tightening. He had never done this before. Never had anyone to visit. Never had a place where someone was waiting for him. Daniel stopped in front of a stone, his breath slow, measured. Elliot stepped forward, staring at the name carved into the marble. Her name. His mother's name. The wind rustled softly around them. Elliot crouched down, carefully placing the lilies at the base of the grave. His fingers brushed against the cold stone, tracing the letters, the only physical proof he had that she had been real. Daniel stood behind him, silent, letting him take his time. Elliot swallowed hard. She looks like me, he finally whispered. Daniel's throat tightened. She does. Elliot let out a shaky breath, his shoulders tensing. I don't remember her. His voice cracked slightly. I try, but I can't. Daniel stepped closer. She would have wanted you to be happy. His voice was rough, raw with emotion. She would have wanted you to be safe. Elliot's fingers curled into his sleeves. Do you think she'd be okay with this? Daniel frowned slightly. With what? Elliot hesitated. With you being the one to raise me. Daniel's heart twisted. He knelt beside Elliot, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. I think, he said carefully, that she left me that note for a reason. Elliot swallowed. I think she knew I'd find you, Daniel continued. I think she knew I'd love you. Elliot's breath hitched. And suddenly, before Daniel could react, the boy turned and wrapped his arms around him. A quiet, desperate hug. Daniel barely had time to process before he hugged him back, firm, steady. You're not alone anymore, Daniel murmured. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut. Neither are you, he whispered. The ride home was quieter, but lighter. Elliot sat in the passenger seat, his fingers curled around the newest photo Daniel had given him. A picture of his mother, the picture of them together, the piece of her he could keep. He turned to Daniel, watching as he drove. Can we come back next year? Daniel smiled. Every year. That night, as Daniel locked up the house and turned off the lights, he found Elliot already curled up on the couch, half asleep. He looked comfortable. Like he belonged. Daniel grabbed a blanket, draping it over him carefully. Elliot stirred slightly but didn't wake. Daniel watched him for a moment longer. Then, just before he turned to go, Elliot's voice, soft and groggy, Dad? Daniel froze. His heart stopped. He turned slowly. Elliot's eyes were barely open, his words slurred with sleep. But he had said it. He had called him Dad. Daniel's throat closed, his vision blurring. For a long time, he had never imagined being a father. Now, he couldn't imagine not being one. He smiled. Yeah, kid? Elliot shifted under the blanket, nestling deeper into the couch. Good night. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. And softly, good night, Elliot. And for the first time in a long, long time, they both slept peacefully. Together. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the living room. Elliot stirred under the blanket, blinking slowly as he adjusted to the light. For the first time in a long time, he woke up without panic. Without the fear that the past few months had been a dream. That he'd open his eyes and find himself back in the orphanage, back on the streets, back to nothing. But no. The warmth of the blanket, the steady hum of the heater, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, it was real. He had a home now. A real home. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he deserved it. Daniel was at the kitchen counter, flipping through the morning paper when Elliot wandered in. Morning, kid, Daniel said without looking up. Elliot rubbed his eyes. Morning. Daniel glanced at him, taking in the boy's messy hair and sleepy face. You sleep okay? Elliot hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Daniel grinned. See? Told you my couch was magical. Elliot rolled his eyes. It's just a couch. Daniel gasped in mock offense. You take that back. Elliot smirked, grabbing a glass of water. It was easy now. The jokes, the banter, the comfort. A few months ago, the idea of feeling this safe, this normal, would have felt impossible. Now it was just life. His life. After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his coat. Come on, he said. I've got something to show you. Elliot frowned. Where are we going? You'll see. Elliot crossed his arms. That's suspicious. Daniel smirked. Just get your shoes, kid. The drive was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Elliot watched the world pass by through the window, hands tucked into the sleeves of his sweater. Eventually, Daniel pulled up to a small neighborhood. Elliot stared. Where are we? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he parked the car and motioned for Elliot to follow. Elliot climbed out, still confused, as Daniel led him to a small, single-story house. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, inviting, safe. Daniel turned to him, hands in his pockets. I bought it, he said simply. Elliot's breath hitched. What? This house, Daniel said. It's ours. Elliot just stared. Ours. Not just Daniel's. Not just some temporary place where he could crash until he was old enough to be on his own. Ours. Elliot's chest tightened. Daniel continued, his voice softer. The apartment was never meant to be permanent. But this? He gestured at the house. This is home. For both of us. Elliot couldn't breathe. He had spent his entire life waiting for a moment like this. And now that it was here, he didn't know what to do with it. Daniel ruffled his hair. You gonna say something, or are you just gonna stand there like I broke your brain? Elliot finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. This is really ours? Daniel nodded. Yeah, it is. Elliot swallowed hard. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he threw his arms around Daniel. Daniel stiffened slightly in surprise. Then slowly he hugged him back. Tightly, firmly, like a promise. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being left behind. He had a home. He had a father. And for the first time, he truly believed he had a future. Moving into the house was an adventure. Daniel, despite being a fully grown man, had no idea how to assemble furniture. Elliot watched, arms crossed, as Daniel struggled with a bookshelf from hell. Are you sure you're doing it right? Elliot asked. Daniel groaned. It's a bookshelf, not a nuclear bomb, Elliot. It's upside down. Daniel froze. Then sighed. Elliot smirked. I think we should call for help. Daniel glared at him. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Elliot grinned. Absolutely. The house started to come together little by little. Daniel let Elliot pick his own room, let him paint it whatever color he wanted. Elliot stared at the blank walls, the emptiness of it all, the overwhelming possibility of having something that was his. Daniel noticed the hesitation. You don't have to decide today, he said gently. Elliot nodded. But that night, before bed, he made a decision. He painted one wall a deep shade of blue, like the sky at night, the kind of sky that made you feel safe, warm, at peace, just like he did now. The first morning in the new house, Elliot woke up and, for the first time, he didn't wake up afraid. He stretched, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of Daniel in the kitchen, probably making something burnt and inedible. Elliot shook his head. Some things never changed. And for the first time, that was a good thing. He got up, padded to the kitchen, and found Daniel frowning at a pan of what used to be pancakes. Wow, Elliot said dryly. You're getting worse. Daniel shot him a look. You want breakfast or what? Elliot smirked. Maybe I should start cooking. Daniel grinned. Maybe you should. And just like that, it was settled. A few days later, Elliot stood at the doorway of his new school. He had been to schools before, but none of them had ever felt like something that mattered. But now it felt different. Daniel nudged him. You okay? Elliot swallowed. Yeah. Daniel tilted his head. Elliot sighed. No. Daniel smirked. That's fair. Elliot glanced at him. What if I don't fit in? Daniel shrugged. Then we find a different school. Elliot blinked. You do that? Of course. Elliot exhaled. Then, after a moment, he stepped forward. Daniel didn't leave until he saw him walk inside. He stayed in the parking lot until he was sure Elliot was okay. And when Elliot got home that day, Daniel was waiting. Like always. Like he always would. The house became a home. The walls filled with pictures. Laughter echoed through the rooms. And on nights when Elliot couldn't sleep, when old fears tried to creep back in, all he had to do was listen. To the sound of Daniel's steady breathing in the next room. To the soft hum of the heater. To the small, comforting noises of a home that belonged to him. To a life he had never thought he'd have. A life that was finally, truly his. One night, as Daniel flipped through an old book in the living room, Elliot sat beside him, fidgeting slightly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Something on your mind? Elliot hesitated. Do you think she'd be happy? Daniel didn't ask who. He just smiled, setting the book down. I think she'd be proud. Elliot nodded. Then, barely above a whisper, I miss her. Daniel wrapped an arm around his shoulders. I do too, kid. Elliot exhaled. And for the first time in his life, missing someone didn't feel so lonely. Because now, he had someone to miss her with. And somehow, that made all the difference. The seasons changed. Winter melted into spring, the icy sidewalks giving way to fresh green grass and warm breezes. The once quiet house was now filled with motion, laughter, and life. Elliot had never known stability before. Never had a room that was his, a routine that didn't end with someone telling him to move along. But now he had Daniel. Now he had a home. And for the first time, he wasn't just existing. He was living. The new school was different. Not just because of the students or the teachers or the way the hallways always smelled like old books and pencil shavings, but because this time, Elliot wasn't alone. The first few weeks were rough. Kids weren't exactly welcoming to someone who had learned to keep his head down and stay quiet. But he adjusted. Slowly, carefully. It started with a teacher noticing his writing skills, encouraging him to submit something for the school paper. Then came a small group project where one of the boys in his class, Noah, actually talked to him like a friend. One day after school, Daniel pulled up to pick him up and found him laughing with someone in the parking lot. Daniel didn't say anything about it, but he did smile the whole way home. Elliot's nightmares didn't stop completely. They still came in waves, creeping up when he least expected them. Some nights, he still woke up feeling like he was back in the orphanage, back on the streets, back to being just a name on a file that no one cared about. But now he had a door he could knock on. Now he had someone who was always there. The first time Daniel found him sitting outside his bedroom door, knees pulled to his chest, he didn't ask questions. He just pulled the blanket off his bed, wrapped it around Elliot's shoulders, and sat beside him. They stayed like that for a long time. Not talking, not needing to. And in the morning, Daniel made pancakes. Because that's what family did. Months passed. Elliot settled into his new life, his new routines. And then, one afternoon, Daniel picked him up from school, tapping the steering wheel with a knowing smirk. "I have a surprise for you." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Last time you said that, you made me build a bookshelf." Daniel grinned. "Okay, yeah, but this time it's actually fun." Elliot crossed his arms, skeptical. Define fun. Daniel just chuckled and kept driving. They pulled up to a quiet suburban neighborhood, and Elliot's confusion deepened. Daniel parked in front of a modest house and turned to him. "Come on," he said. Elliot hesitated but followed him up the driveway. Daniel knocked on the door. A few moments later, it opened. And standing there was Noah. Elliot blinked. "What are you doing here?" Noah smirked. "What are you doing here?" Elliot turned to Daniel, eyes narrowing. "Did you?" Daniel held up his hands innocently. "I may have spoken to Noah's parents." Elliot stared. Daniel grinned. "You have a friend now. I figured you guys could hang out outside of school." Elliot wasn't sure what to say. He had never had someone go out of their way to make sure he had a place to belong. Never had someone who cared about his life beyond just keeping him fed and safe. Daniel nudged him lightly. "You gonna stand there all day? Or are you gonna go inside?" Elliot turned back to Noah, who just shrugged. "We have video games." That was all it took. Elliot wasn't used to belonging anywhere. Not in school. Not in the orphanage. Not even in the world. But sitting on Noah's floor, controller in hand, joking around like he had always been a part of this? It felt normal. And that feeling, that sense of normalcy, was everything. That night, when Daniel picked him up, Elliot was quieter than usual. Daniel glanced at him as they drove home. "Everything okay?" Elliot nodded. After a moment, he murmured, "Thanks." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Elliot hesitated, then shrugged. "For today. For everything." Daniel smiled, ruffling his hair. "Anytime, kid." Elliot rolled his eyes, but didn't move away. Spring turned into summer. The house wasn't just walls and a roof anymore. It was a home. And one afternoon, as Daniel and Elliot sat on the back porch, drinking lemonade and watching the sunset, Elliot turned to him, voice quiet. "I think I'm happy." Daniel set his drink down, studying him carefully. "Yeah." Elliot nodded. "Yeah." Daniel let the moment settle between them. Then, softly, honestly, he smiled. "Me too." Years later, Elliot would look back at this moment. At the warmth in Daniel's voice, the golden glow of the setting sun, the easy comfort between them. And he would realize, This was the moment he stopped being afraid of the future. This was the moment he knew. He had found his family. And nothing would ever change that. Not ever.